So Eve, I really enjoyed your presentation on becoming literate in faith settings in the lives of New Londoners. So for the benefit of people who were not able to be present for your talk, and will have an opportunity to view a short vignette of this interview, would you give us a brief synopsis of your talk?
Yes, in this talk I try to show how children, when they are in their faith settings and when they are at home enacting some of the things they do in their faith settings, don't just learn about faith and they don't just learn about worship, but they learn a number of academic skills and a lot of academic knowledge as well. And so in the talk I try to show how these different skills are encapsulated, if you like, in a sense of belonging, because what we find that faith is doing, especially for the lives of new immigrant families, is to give them a sense of community, a sense of security, and a sense of belonging. And so I take the listeners through a number of film clips showing how children learn in their home context, in their place of worship, as well as in their faith classes. Broadly, that's what I've done in the talk, I hope. I suppose the first thing is, and that's impressed us all who've been working on the project, is the huge nature of the scope of literacy practices, as well as other learning practices that take place in children's lives. Faith isn't just a bolt-on, it actually permeates children's everyday lives. And so in almost everything they do, there's something linked with their faith. Whether it be getting up in the mornings, some of them have their prayers, or whether it be just in the way they speak, or whether it be in the way they actually communicate with each other, or moral behaviour. So faith really permeates so much of what they do. So that's the first important thing. And they really do a lot. We've filmed children dancing, singing, making things, mimes, all sorts of different things. The second thing I think that I've learned from our project is that faith provides a sort of thread of continuity across generations, especially when people come to a new country. You know, when you step into a new country, everything is alien to you. And then when you're able to go to your faith community, you're accepted. You know what the rules are, you know how to behave, you know what to say. But also, it somehow gives a value to older people in the community because they are the holders of the knowledge. And they pass that down not just to the middle generation, but to young children as well. And so faith actually provides that thread of continuity, I think. And a third thing would be what I said at the beginning, that feeling of belonging that children have. Often children don't particularly feel they belong in a new place for some time. And yet in the faith setting, everything that they do is accepted, really, so long as they keep within the sort of behaviour patterns that obviously people are expecting. But they are accepted as members of that community, and even if they don't know things at the beginning, they will learn them. Nobody expects them to be perfect. In a way, they want to be perfect because they want to practice things. And that goes back to watching people who are older, of an older generation, do these things, because I suppose in some respects faith is one of the few activities or cultural practices, if you want to see it like that, where people of different generations all participate on an equal footing. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
It's not as though when you pray, when you worship, that an older person is any more important than a young person, or vice versa. And that's actually very unusual. Because most cultural practices actually are either generation specific, or you have someone who's the apprentice for someone who's older. But actually, when you're worshipping, that's not the case.
Lovely.
Well, I suppose there are two aspects. One is more a research-oriented project, and the other is more practice-based. As far as research is concerned, what's come up over and over again is the question, I wonder how much children are able to use of this knowledge and these skills in their early childhood setting or in their school, because basically we don't know, there's been no research, to my knowledge anyway, done to actually trace those children who we've got all this data on in a certain setting, in their faith setting, and in the home relating to their faith setting. We don't know how much they can take on into school or how much they do take on, but that would be a really fascinating study, wouldn't it, now, to be able to follow those children into the classroom and to see, you know, whether in their narratives that they actually are able to write. I mean, we saw one example of a little girl, Tanya, who talked about Cinderella and Krishna. What does she do in her actual school with around all of that? The skills of sort of art, symmetry, beautiful designs that children are learning, how much are they able to use any of that in school? So that would be a research project which I think would be fascinating to do. On a more practical level, I'd love to actually be able to take the findings that we've got and the films, the scrapbooks, etc. that we've got, and show teachers and just talk to teachers about all of that, and to first of all be in awe and wonder, if you like, of what children can do, and second to talk about how they might be able to build upon that in their own work. So there's two aspects, I think, on a practical level and a more theoretical study level.
It would really help.
Well, I think the big challenge for teachers, and it seems to be the big challenge anyway, is that if they themselves don't have any faith belief or religious belief, it's actually quite difficult for them to get beyond belief itself per se, to see how children are actually learning and to see belief as a very important part of culture, because actually, if you don't acknowledge children and their families' cultures, then you're never really going to be able to appreciate their values and what they can and can't do. And so they tend to see, I think there's a tendency to see faith as not as a part of a culture somehow, but something different. And so some teachers feel uncomfortable with that, I think. And of course they may also feel, well, this is a private part of people's lives, I don't want to intrude. And finally, I think a challenge for them is to step outside the accepted curriculum now, because certainly in the UK, I'm afraid we have rather a narrow curriculum, especially as far as literacy and numeracy are concerned, as you saw this morning, numeracy too. And so they quite frankly feel, well, I haven't got time to do any of that, you know, I better just stick with what's in the curriculum. As far as policy makers are concerned, I think they also need to be aware of all these skills that children are developing, because they're interested in getting the most out of children, and that children should obviously do their best and be as successful as possible in their further education. So they need to know more about the skills and knowledge that are taking place on a day-to-day and indeed hour-to-hour almost basis in some children's lives. I think they also need to know more about the intergenerational impacts of this work, in the sense that we often learn that there's little contact between the generations, particularly by older people, much older people, and young children. Well, here is an excellent example to see intergenerational practices going on, and maybe policymakers could learn from that as well. And then I think they also need to understand the importance of faith for new communities to London, because actually people are getting an enormous sense of security from being part of their community, and I think sometimes that's forgotten, and I'm afraid in Britain, I'm not sure about Canada, faith is sometimes seen as disruptive, and the negative aspects are viewed, rather than seeing it as a positive force in the lives of many people, which I'm sure it is. I mean, I'm not denying that it might be negative for a few people, people, and I think they really are in the minority.
Right.
Well, I think one of the assumptions that it challenges is the distinction between first-order socialisation and second-order socialisation, because we tend to think of children's learning at home as being the first-order socialisation, that that's how children are socialised, that's how they're going to be. And we also tend to think about it as being linked with informal learning. Whereas when the child goes to school, we think of it in terms of second-order socialisation and more formal learning. But what I think that this work has shown is that actually the whole thing is much more fluid than that, and that on the one hand, in the home, you can see children engaged in quite formal activities, practicing their faith. But on the other hand, they are in the home, and it's in a very familiar and comfortable surrounding. So I think that the whole division between formal second-order socialisation and informal first-order socialisation at home and school can actually be much more fluid than that, and that a lot of formal learning can take place in the home, in fact. And on the other side, informal learning in the faith class, because in the Sunday school, although the children have very strict parameters of morality, and you could say quite a structured learning, at the same time we have lots of Sunday school classes and their equivalent in the other faiths, where we see that the teacher is very fluid, and she will actually take from what different children have to offer, and she will spring and jump from one subject to another, because she's not, of course, working to that strict curriculum, as well, of course, as it being in a sort of family-type setting, because the church is regarded as one big family, I think, in many respects. So that's one thing. I suppose it contributes as well to intergenerational learning, which is also it is part of early childhood learning, you know, but it's perhaps not acknowledged as much as it could be. And also faith as a mediator of learning. You know, we tend to sort of think of parents as being highly important, and we've gone on now to think of siblings and possibly grandparents and other family members, but we haven't perhaps thought of the larger family, i.e. the faith community, because that is how the participants themselves view the faith, I think. So maybe it makes those contributions.